Hello, good morning. Hi, welcome. Thank you all for being here today for the APS Leaders Institute training on key performance indicators versus qualitative benchmarks. If you could please put your name, county, and title in the chat box for attendance purposes. And still letting people in. The middle. All right, perfect. And we'll go ahead and get started, and let's go over some housekeeping. But again, welcome again. Just going to keep letting people in. And next slide. Okay. Let's see. Housekeeping. My name is Victor Garcia, and I'm going to be the training operations assistant for. I'm a training operations assistant for APSWE, Adult Protective Services Workforce Innovations, and I will be moderating and tech support today. And we'll also be joined by Don Gibson, Rabas Taha, and Megan Juring. And I would also love to introduce our presenters, Erica Parmeli, Laura Holloway, Maria Lorea, and Tiffany Rowe. Don will be taking over momentarily. This training will be from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. and letting more people in. And you should have received a participant manual in an email recently, but I'm going to share one to the, sorry, one second. I'm going to be sharing one in the chat right now. And that's the participant manual. It's cool. And thank you for joining us. And next slide is about the Academy. Okay, I'm going to be give you some information about the Academy. The Academy for Professional Excellence is a project of San Diego State School of Social Work. Its mission is to provide exceptional workforce development and learning experience for the transformation of individuals, organizations, and communities. Adult Protective Services Workforce Innovations, also known as APSWE, provides innovative workforce development for APS professionals and their partners. APSWE is a program of the Academy for Professional Excellence, along with the others listed in this, on the slide. Perfect. And slide. And from all of us at APSWE, we're grateful to have you here today. Sorry, one second. All right. Next one is the purpose of the land. We're going to be doing the land acknowledgement. The purpose of the land acknowledgement is to recognize the relationships of Indigenous people to the land. It is multifaceted in its meaning. It shows respect to the people of the land, itself, and their relationship to one another. There are statements that recognize the dispositions from the land, the harm brought by colonial practices, beliefs, and policies. They validate and recognize the continued presence of Indigenous peoples everywhere. Lastly, when offered in earnest and with sincerity, they are the first steps to reconciliation and healing. Okay, copy. And I'll be adding a link to the chats right now so that everyone can find out what land they're on right now. I'm currently on Kumi Island. Okay, for millennia, over hundreds of tribal nations have been part of this land. This land has nourished, healed, and protected and embraced them for many generations in a relationship of balance and harmony. As members of the Academy community, we acknowledge this legacy. We promote their balance and harmony. We find inspiration from this land and the land of the original inhabitants of California. Making a statement isn't enough. It is important that we share ways people can take action to support Native American people and land back efforts. How to take action. While developing a land acknowledgement statement, a statement is important. Is an important step towards reconciliation and healing. The statement alone is not enough. It is important to also identify concrete steps and actions that can be taken. These actions can involve putting in time and effort to research and learn more about the Indigenous communities of the lands you are on, returning artifacts and land to their appropriate tribal communities, working to protect and preserve the land, and much more. I'm going to be placing another link in the chat in a moment. And that you could see all the ways that you could take action. And now let's get started with we're going to get over with the overview of technology. Many of you may be familiar with navigating through a virtual learning course, but it is good to cover our bases. So we'll be reviewing various functions that we will use during the course before we begin. First off, there's the mic button. Click the microphone button icon for audio options, where you can mute and unmute yourself. While we're listening and hearing other people speak, please press mute while listening, and press mute while other people are speaking. Next, there is the video camera function. Click the video icon to share and unshare your camera. If you have access to a camera, please turn them on. We would love to see your guys' faces today. Next, there is, you can update your name by clicking on the participant button right there. To update your name if needed, hover over your name, select more, then select rename. By doing this, it helps me to take attendance. Next, there's the chat box function. Speaking of attendance, if you haven't already, please type in your name, county in the chat if you have not done so already for attendance purposes. Next, there is the reaction button. The reaction tab is where you can provide reactions, but like raising your hand if you would like to ask questions, or my personal favorite, a thumbs up if you love this training. As a reminder, you are all expected to attend the entirety of this course, but if you need to step away, please or log off, please private message me. Also, technological glitches are inevitable for both my end and yours, so we appreciate your patience and forgiveness as we navigate together. Now that that's all the way, I'm going to be handing it over to Dawn.
So much, Victor, and welcome again. We are so excited to have you all here with us, and we're setting records today for Leaders Institute. This is the largest number of attendance that we've ever had at a Leaders Institute workshop. So I think we've really found a hot topic with in the area of quality assurance. So my name is Dawn Gibbons McWayne. I'm the program manager for APSWE, or Adult Protective Services Workforce Innovations. Thank you so much, Victor, our training operations assistant. And I think we had quite a few people join since Victor did the initial introduction. So I also want to introduce Rabaz, our training operations supervisor, right? Rabaz recently had a title change. I want to make sure I had that right. And then Megan Jury, or Megan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. It's so great to see your faces. Thank you for having your cameras on. For those who are able, I'm Megan Juring. I'm the training coordinator for the Leaders Institute.
Thanks, Megan. So we've got a good group from our AppSuite team here today supporting this great workshop. We're here today. One of the great purposes of the Leaders Institute is to support APS and adult services leaders, and to provide learning opportunities, and also to support you all in making connections between colleagues, because there's no one that understands better the extremely challenging work that you do than your colleagues. And many of them are here in the room today. So as Victor had said, today we're here to talk about QA evaluation, specifically key performance indicators and qualitative benchmarks. This is part one, and then in April, we are going to be presenting, or Erica and Laura will be presenting again on part two, which is basically once you get your QA results, how do you figure out what's going on and what do you do with that information? One thing that I want to mention about this presentation, and the members of our advisory committee who had seen this workshop at NAPSA, one of the things that really resonated with them, and you'll be hearing this from Laura and Erica, is that this is not a punitive process. So there is a part of this in terms of whether you're implementing QA to begin with, or different pieces of QA. It's not meant to be punitive. There is a part of this about really wanting to calm staff fears and manage the change management and roll out. It's really more about what do you do with the information that you find? Where do you see the opportunities to advance the needs of your APS program? So that's really the focus here. Quick review of the agenda. We'll have our panel presentation, and then we're doing things a little bit differently with the Q&A this time. We have a moderated QA by some of your county peers, Maria Loera from Riverside County and Tiffany Rowe from Butte County. Then we will be having a breakout group time. We heard your feedback about wanting smaller groups and a longer length of time to really be able to engage in more discussion. So we're doing that this time. In the breakout groups, we'll have a Google Doc set up with some discussion points so that we can gather just some of your high level themes, and then to be able to take bring all of that information together and theme it and send it out to you. After the breakout groups, we'll do a brief wrap up, and then as always, evaluation. We really, really want to know your thoughts and what makes this most practical and meaningful for you. So if you've been to any of our trainings before, Leaders Institute or otherwise, you'll know that at the end, I'm going to ask you, what worked, what didn't, what do you want more of, what do you want less of? And we really do want to know. We take that information and then we use it to inform the very next workshop. So please be thinking about that as we move along. As we get ready to get started, we are going to launch a Zoom poll. Victor, will you get that ready to roll? We want to know, does your county currently implement an APS quality assurance system? So this is specific to APS. I know that some of you may oversee multiple programs, and please know any answer is okay. If you're doing QA already, fantastic. If you're not, also okay. Counties are resourced differently, have different priorities. So even if you don't have any QA happening yet so far, or you don't think that you do, please know that an answer of yes is fine, and an answer of no, also totally fine. This is anonymous. We don't know who's saying what. It's just helpful to get a sense of kind of within the group here today, which APS programs are currently engaged in quality assurance and which aren't. Wow, it is like almost a 50-50 split here. It's very, very close. We're at 48, 47, 53. Okay, get your answers in. We're going to close in a few more seconds. Yeah, the numbers are changing just slightly, but it's really looking like about half and half. Okay, if you haven't answered, get your answers in. And we're going to close it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, Victor, go ahead and end the poll, please, and share the results. Wow. It's striking to me that we're just like, it's like 49%, 51%. So about half the group currently has QA implemented, and about half the group does not. So that's really very, very helpful information. All right, thank you so much, Victor. Now we're going to go ahead and move forward with our workshop content. Our presenters today are Erica Parmalee and Laura Holloway. Thank you so much for joining us from Washington State. And I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having us today. I'm hoping everyone can see my screen. It has the agenda on it.
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Thank you. So today we're going to be going over Washington State's quality management system. We're going to be talking about our structure, figuring out considerations for question development, and then talking about the difference between key performance indicators and qualitative benchmarks and how we use QA within Washington State. So in Washington State, this is APS is state administered. I know you guys work in counties. We cover APS for the entire state of Washington. We have 3 regions and a centralized intake, and we have 600 or more employees, including 400 or more investigators. In 2023, we received over 74,000 intakes, and 45,000 investigations were closed during 2023, which is more than we had in the previous year. APS investigates allegations of abuse in the community as well as within facilities. And in Washington, QA is stationed outside of APS in the Office of the Assistant Secretary. So you'll hear OAS quite a bit, Office of the Assistant Secretary. And so while APS guides our areas for review, including establishing proficiencies and how to review, QA staff complete the reviews, allowing for that clear separation. In the handouts that we gave, which are at the end of the participants manual, there is a map of DSHS and ALTSA and kind of how we shake out. So we're all part of the same organization, but we are separate. Central intake and each region are reviewed separately at the OAS level 1 time a year. And then we have subject matter experts who complete reviews throughout the year utilizing the same process. All right. Laura, that's you. And you're muted.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. As was mentioned, I do think that if you have a change management administrator or program manager or anyone that specializes in that area, I would engage with them if you're starting a quality management system, just because this is a lot of change for people and it's very stressful for people. It's almost like our test, for adults. And people get a little bit of test anxiety. So I would suggest working with them. And as I talk through these few slides here, it would be the information that I would share with staff before developing a quality management system. And it is okay if you already have one and you haven't done this, it's okay to go back and do this again and go over these things with people. Because I'm sure they have these questions in mind. At least that's what I've discovered. So as we look at this slide, in our case in Washington State, we have a lot of regulations that we must follow. We have a lot of reporting requirements because we get a lot of federal funding. In some cases, over half of our budget is federal funding, and we have over $6 billion in our budget. Not just for APS, that's all of Aging and Long-Term Support Administration. So we do have to keep in mind that we have to follow federal regulations and state regulations. So what I like to do is explain to staff, why do we have to have a quality management system in the first place? So you can see on this slide, there's a Code of Federal Regulations that we must follow, as well as Revised Code of Washington that states you must have a quality management system. You must report these assurances to CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, where we get our funding. And we must report these things. You must have internal controls, those kind of things. That's all in our waivers and our state plan. My understanding is you do not have waivers and state plans. You are run differently, which is okay. So this is maybe something you don't need to go over with them. But what I would say is I would suggest you go into maybe your contract language that you have with the counties. If you have a memorandum of understanding, if you have anything like that, I would go in there and double check that it doesn't say something about having internal controls, quality management, checks and balances of some sort. They might call it monitoring. It might be something different, because you see in the CFR, it's a little bit different language. Reasonable assurance, satisfactory assurance. You have to have internal controls. QA is often internal controls. This one's very specific for RCW. Implement a quality management, accountability, and performance system. So it may be worded differently in your contract language or whatever you have, but just check. That way, if you do have something you can share that with staff, that we must do this because of the contract we have with the county that states we must monitor the work that we do, whatever it says. So that is just a suggestion that you go look into that. Next slide, please. Okay, so for us, we have chosen to have follow the quality management system of ISO 9001, which stands for International Organization for Standardization. And it's based on this quality management system. And I say that because I don't know about you, but I have not found a quality management system that focuses on service delivery. It's all product and manufacturing. And so it didn't really fit, but it's something that we learned about early on when we were creating our quality management system. And there were definitely principles that I really could appreciate. And I did take components of it, and I have that all documented. But today, what I want to talk about specifically is the process approach. And that is a big philosophy that we follow at ALTSA. So when we talk about the process, we break it down, or we organize it in the following. So I start with policy. So that's what we have to do, right? We have the Code of Federal Regulations, RCWs, WACs, that's Washington Administrative Code, things of that nature, regulations from CMS. You may have different policies at your level and what that's called in California in your counties, but it's the high level policy. But as we know, we have policy, but it doesn't really tell us how we are supposed to do it, just that we must do it, right? So then we have procedures, and that could be your manuals. We have management bulletins, you have local procedures, checklists, things of that nature. Whatever your procedures are, that's how we're going to ensure that we're following the policy, right? So we must have both of those things. So for instance, if you have a policy that states that you must contact an alleged victim within 24 hours of knowledge or the intake coming in. So you have that 24 hours, we must respond. However, you then have to tell someone, okay, is that business hours, 24 hours, or is that, from the time that you receive the voicemail or the notification, or is that when we pick up that at 8 a.m. in the morning? What is it? We have had a lot of these type of questions. These are the little gaps that we have to think about. You have to have procedures to know where they're supposed to document that stuff. Where do you want us to put that information? All that must be in your procedures and written clearly so they know what they're supposed to do. The other thing is organizational structure. So that's how you utilize the staff that you have. Some people have case aides. Some people do not. Some people have the administrative staff calling the doctors for the diagnoses and things of that nature. Some people have the investigator doing everything. So it just depends how you want to organize people and how that works most efficiently. That's something that you do need to keep in mind within your process. The resources is a very big component. So you have your staff, you have your FTEs, that is big, but you also have the training they receive, the software they use. Does it avoid human error? Can you not move to the next screen until you put in the desired information? Whatever it is, how up to date is your software? The equipment that they use. Does it take forever to get information because it's just so slow and outdated? That could really impact their performance. Or maybe the office space. Do they telework or do they come in, or is it hybrid? What is it? What makes your staff work the most efficiently? That stuff's really important to know as well. And then you, of course, have your system improvements, the regular review of that system so you can have predictable outcomes. So as I was talking through this, I hope you were saying, there's a lot of different people that are a part of that process. And it isn't just the investigator or the intake worker, right? It's a lot of different people that take part in that process and its success. So then think about it. The investigator or intake worker, they don't write policies and procedures. They don't determine how to utilize the staff for resources. They don't train themselves. They don't determine funding for FTE or enhancements of technology. They can't they can't create the software. I mean, there's a lot of the components they actually cannot impact. They can follow the policies and procedures. They can pay attention during the training. They definitely have a part in this for sure. But it doesn't seem fair to look at QA findings and determine their work performance on something that they didn't have control over, right? That is why we state this isn't a performance evaluation. The results should not even be included in their performance evaluation of the year. We are, as Erica will discuss, we are sampling maybe a couple cases for each investigator in a particular region. That does not dictate how great of an investigator they are for these 2 cases that they did. But if I put those 2 cases with these 2 cases with these 2 cases, I can start seeing trends across the state or regions or particular units. If I put them all together, I can look at that process and see if we have issues somewhere. But it's definitely not to determine their worth. I always like to say before we start working with people that the only assumption I'm making before we look at the data is that they're working hard, they're trying their best, and they want to do a good job. And you should see their shoulders just drop of relief because they're so worried that we're going to think they don't do well. And that's why they hate QA. They do not like QA at all. They don't want to get the results because they're worried how they'll be judged. And so we take that component away. This is about the process, right? This is about predictable outcomes. That's the goal of QA. We want to be continuously improving and using a process that is effective, that anyone can use and have the same positive, predictable outcomes, right? They're accurate, they're timely, they're efficient, and they're quality. That's the goal. So keep that in mind. What is your approach? What is your philosophy? What is your goal for all this? That's something that you should know before starting your quality management system and working with staff so that they're aware. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we talked about why we have to do it. In our case, mandated. There's the principles and our process approach. And so it's important to talk about the purpose. What's the purpose of this? Why are we doing this? So in our case, we do have to be in federal compliance, right? Many people are not aware that if we're not in compliance and we get audited, that we would have to pay back the federal share. Some people do not know that. Now, in our case, the APS is, as stated, state-run, mostly all state dollars. We do have some administrative costs for federal in our case. So it can be impacted by that. If we lose waivers, et cetera, that can deeply impact. So we do have to care about that. When you have a budget over $6 billion and half of it is federal dollars, it greatly impacts things if we're not in compliance. So that's important for them to know. Again, the goal, the purpose is to identify the gaps in the process, not performance eval, the gaps as a whole, and all the parts of the process that I talked about that we all have participation in. That is it. We have found also that because we have been doing QA for quite some time, we've been looking at root cause, which we'll talk about in the next training. It has been helpful to leadership to figure out where they need to put their resources. Without that, they're just kind of guessing. Maybe we need more FTEs, maybe we don't. Maybe we need more technology. Maybe we need to change the training or be better with our procedures and the way they're written. Maybe it's not FTEs at all. So that's just something to keep in mind, that QA can really be helpful to educate the leadership of where they need the most support. In our case, we have a CFR, as I mentioned, to have internal controls. QA is a great way to have that. In our case, we have state auditors that come in and they determine if we have internal controls to be in compliance, and we're able to show them that we have a QA management system. And so that meets their needs. So that's helpful. We also have a lot of different Proficiency improvement plans, that comes as a result of our QA review. We call them QA process reviews. They're not audits or anything like that. We call them QA process reviews because that's what we're reviewing, not people. And we have corrective action plans. That's more the state auditors. We have lean efforts as well. If people are familiar with lean, they have action plans. And so QA is very helpful of the check to see if those countermeasures or interventions were effective. So without the QA checking these things, we're kind of going in blind. We're making a lot of guesses that may not be appropriate and helping our staff be successful. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so far, you know, when I'm talking about this kind of stuff, typically the leadership, it makes a lot of sense to them as I'm going through. Okay, that makes sense. We need to do this for this reason, be in compliance, but that doesn't really speak to the heart of our investigators. You know, all I said was, yeah, for this reason, you need to click a box and you need to make sure you're in compliance and we need to keep protecting that federal share and things of that nature. And it's just not why they come to work. So you need to find out from your perspective and your set, what's important to them and connect that to QA so that they can buy into this. Why is this important? So to me, I think the first step is looking at your mission statement. In our case, it's to transform lives by promoting choice, independence, and safety through innovative services. So when you think of QA, I have them stop and say, when you think of QA and you think of APS, do you think APS would impact our mission with choice, independence, and safety? And of course, APS does all of that. And so I like to state, we literally cannot complete our mission without APS and the work that they do. If that is the case, don't you think that it's important that we are doing things timely, we are doing things accurately, we are making sure that people have those choices and independence and that people are safety? And a lot of that is by following policies and procedures and doing what we need to do. And so we are checking those things to make sure we're doing that and accomplishing this mission. A lot of our staff actually apply for the jobs we have because of this mission and the belief of this mission. And so usually that makes sense to them. We also have a strategic plan, which I'm sure you all do as well. And we have certain objectives and measures and action plans. And we do incorporate our staff to help give feedback on our strategic plan and what they think is important and what we should do. And so I like to remind them that we do have some APS performance measures in the strategic plan related to investigation closures and the timeliness of that, response to intake priorities, such as getting out within 24 hours, 2 days, etc. And so, again, QA is going to help check those things and figure out root cause and helping that process so we can meet our strategic plan objectives. Oftentimes I do get questioned about how does QA help ensure the health and well-being of the people we serve, Laura, by checking a box correctly. That doesn't improve our outcomes necessarily because I documented perfectly. I would have to disagree in some situations. So I like to tie the health and well-being of the people we serve with the safeguarding federal and state funding or county funding, if there's contract agreements, whatever that is. In our case, if we lose a waiver or the state plan is affected, that will impact people in the community greatly. Because when you don't have a caregiver helping people in the community, in our case, we have a lot of individuals that receive care in their home through the community first choice waiver. So we really want to keep them safe in the community. And if they lose a waiver and hundreds, thousands of people lose services, that will affect APS greatly, because there will be people that don't have supervision, they don't have advocates, they don't have people coming in. They could increase abuse, neglect, exploitation, self-neglect, even if they don't have someone. So it is important that we safeguard that. And if by checking a box or doing a certain documentation shows an CMS or auditors that we completed something and it saves the waiver, it does help us overall. So We really try to explain to them why each of these QA questions are important. We usually tie it to some type of RCW or a reason why we're asking the question, whether that's our strategic plan, whether that's RCW, whatever, health and safety of the people we serve. We explain that to them for each QA question. Here's why we're asking it. So that's important to do as well. The other thing is reducing liability and risk. That could be twofold, right? So it could be because you didn't document correctly, because we didn't do the proper steps, someone literally died. And I know with this group, I don't sound dramatic. Some people say, well, you're dramatic, Laura. People dying. Yes. In APS, it's life and death sometimes. And if we do not get out there within the time that we need to, within 24 hours, etc., and someone passes away because we did not follow our protocol, that is a huge liability, and you will get a lot of litigation costs. In the last 5 years, we've had over $20 million in litigation costs. That could be going somewhere else to the people we serve. So it is important that we care how we document what we do, follow timelines, because it does make a difference. The other part is that you could have the case where you didn't document well, you didn't follow the steps, therefore you did not substantiate. In our case, that's what we call it, substantiating the finding, and therefore the alleged perpetrator is free to possibly harm that individual again or someone else, because we didn't follow what we needed to do. Now we have risk to other people. So it could be twofold, right? And so that's something people need to care about. The QA review can be super helpful with making sure all your, the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed and things of that nature by helping. It doesn't have to be a bad thing that QA is checking behind you. It could be a great resource to help you go, okay, I didn't know I had to do that. I will make sure all that gets done. And you'll be very grateful if you're in court and you have to remember what happened 3 years ago and you had great documentation, you followed everything correctly. That will be very reassuring, because that can be very stressful. The other thing is increasing efficiency and compliance with regulations. In our case, we have, and Erica can correct me, but we have many investigators with 70 to 100 cases on their load at one time. So it's a lot of work, and we don't necessarily get more FTEs. So we have to be as efficient as possible and be in compliance, so that we can utilize what we have. And so these may not be the why it's important to your people or in your county. You have a little different nuance. You don't have the federal funding and things you have to worry about. But I still think liability and risk, being efficient, trying to tie it to your mission, talk about that more is important to your staff. So just something to think about. My section is kind of done now, but I just think it's super important that you talk to people about why you're doing it and what you're doing, what's the goals, the importance of it before you start. And as I said, you can go back and do this with your staff now. It's okay. What questions do they have? Those kind of things, explaining why you have certain QA questions, why those were selected, things of that nature. And I would do one plug before we move on as far as key performance measures, etc., is don't start too big. Be careful of that. In Washington, we started huge in our home and community services division with 75 questions. Don't do that. And you'll figure out why when we do the root cause analysis discussion of why that is way too much to start with. Start with what's required first. What is legally required? What is in the law? What do we have to do to keep people safe? Start there minimally, then grow as you start to see improvements and things. But okay, next slide for you, Erica.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. And that's a really good point, is to not start too huge. A lot of times in APS, we hear, oh, well, we have to do things a certain way because QA is gonna get you, or QA said we have to do it this way. But in reality, that's not why we do investigations or intakes the way we do. In Washington State, we have the Revised Code of Washington or the Washington Administrative Code. Those are our laws that relate to the protection of vulnerable adults. From those laws, we've developed our policies and procedures, and this is to allow us to be consistent in how we use those laws to support our vulnerable adults. We have a pretty robust training. We've got a statewide training program, and then each area has their own training staff. And we use training to provide the guidance and education on how to put those policies and procedures into action. What does that actually look like in the day-to-day? Our supervisors play a very large role in ensuring that the APS process is consistent and understood by reinforcing that training with established policies and procedures and applicable laws. And then the documentation is really important. This is how we know that we're actually doing the process of protecting the safety of the vulnerable adults in accordance with all of that. And as you can tell, nowhere in there does it say, QA comes in there and says, well, do it this way. QA looks at the policies and procedures and looks at the documentation to see if those match. And if it doesn't match, that's where the disconnect is. So we've been looking at the QA process reviews since 2016, looking at key performance indicators. And QA is just that measurement of the data points showing adherence to policy. So an investigation or intake has many different pieces. So RCW or WAC are the laws related to APS. The vulnerable adult status is key to ensure that APS has jurisdiction to investigate. Interviews with the alleged victim, the alleged perpetrator, and collateral contacts are key for that investigation. We examine timelines of actions within the investigation, including when the intake was created based on knowledge date, and if the case was closed within 90 days. We examine the evidence gathered to support the investigation. The expectation is that all allegations at the time of intake, as well as any which may have been uncovered, are addressed. The disposition, which is also known as the finding, is reviewed to ensure it is supported by the documentation. We also examine the decision-making ability of the AV because it's key to addressing the whole picture. And then we also review protective services to ensure that the AV is safe. So those are the key performance indicators that we look at with intakes and investigations for compliance with our written policies and procedures. As you can tell, it doesn't cover the entire picture, all the work that the intake worker or investigator are doing, but these are some really big targets that we've looked at to develop these questions. So this process begins by ensuring that we align the questions and how we review with policy expectations. And we do this at the beginning of every single QA review process. When writing the questions, either for key performance indicators or for quality benchmarks, it's really important to make sure that these questions are specific, measurable, with an understanding of time frame, like how close to certain things does it have to happen? Maybe you need to document certain things within 10 days of the alleged victim interview. We need to make sure that these questions are observable and objective. If we're asking if a form was provided, the question and how to review guidance needs to outline the type of form. And then if you're talking about adding descriptive language to the question, that's great, but that needs to be defined. Does anybody know what adequate means? Right? It's different for every person in every situation. So if you're going to add adequate or pertinent or sufficient, you need to make sure that it's pretty clearly outlined. What does that mean in these situations? How do we use that when we're talking about questions? And if you have questions as the leaders in how to take a look at investigations, then your investigators and your intake workers also have those questions as well. And so it's best to make sure that it's very specific, objective, observable. If you are adding an and into the question, consider making that an additional question. Otherwise, you're going to be measuring two or more things. And we don't want to do that. It makes it a little bit harder. If we're asking two things in one question, maybe they got one in the review, but they got the other one. So that's automatically a no. And then that's really demoralizing when they're doing everything they can. So what we do, the next thing is we grab our sample. So we take the number of cases closed in the prior calendar year for the region or central intake. And from that, we create our sample size. So it's based on a statistically significant sample. And we calculate that using the Rayosoft sample size calculator, which is rayosoft.com. And it's based on those number of cases closed. In this case, in region A, they closed 11,582 cases, which gives us a total sample size of 372. We found that by going back and looking at cases within the prior calendar year for the whole year, we might have already had fixes in place for the known problems. And so the data wasn't as accurate. So we then take those sample from the 3 months before the review start date. Looking at the most recently closed cases helps to ensure the most recent practices were being reviewed. So in looking at the prior 3 months, we had 2,734 cases closed. This is the pool that we randomly select our 372 from. But then we also found that randomly selecting from the entire region, it might be a little bit more imbalanced, where some units might have more cases reviewed than others. So we decided to further select down based on how many cases were closed by each unit. So we figure out of the 2,734, how many cases were closed. We calculate that percentage. So unit 1 had closed 20% of those 2,734. We then take that 20% of 372, and that shows us that unit 1, we'd be reviewing 74 cases. I'm hoping that makes sense. And it just makes it a little bit more balanced. We don't do that by worker within the unit. We do it by the unit. And that gives us a better picture of what's happening for that area, for that training, instead of that individual worker's performance. Because as Laura said, we don't want this to be punitive. We want it to look at the whole system. So we have very specific QA questions, and we use a database system, which is not linked to our investigation database, and it's called QA Monitor. And this allows us to document all reviews within this structure. We have specific questions that we ask, and the reviewers answer yes, no, or NA. We publish a guide on how to review for very clear documentation of what the reviewers are looking for within the investigation or intake documentation. And this is not secret. This is not secret information. This is something that we're very open about. It's published in a management bulletin or policy email every single year. And we also have information that we talk about with our staff frequently. What are we looking for when we're reviewing this specific question? So we try to make sure that it's very clear and transparent. If a no is chosen, this is called a finding. And then the reviewer will choose a no response, which best describes that finding. So for instance, if the interview was conducted in private and we gave a no, we'll give a little bit more information about the no. You notice how in our no responses, we talk about there wasn't documentation that it was in private, or we didn't determine how it was determined, or that there was a third party presence there and we didn't see the documentation in the case note there. And we are trying to be very careful when we write our notes to say it's not in the documentation, not necessarily that it didn't happen, because documentation is the key. We know investigators are doing the work. We know intake workers are doing what they're supposed to do. And when we focus more on it's not in the documentation, that's a little different standard. And that helps the investigator recognize, okay, this might be, I didn't just document it well. This helps our training folks. It helps our supervisors understand more about what's going on. So focusing in on, we didn't find it in the documentation is much better than they just didn't do it. So what is a finding? It's a difference between policy guidance and what QA found, and it points to the gaps in policy, in training, and it shows that our system is not working the way they need to work. And it really is just information. People talk about the finding as, oh, I got a finding. It's, I've heard word deficiencies. It's a ding. It's a problem. It's not, right? It's just information. And we hope that it makes you curious about why. And these are not intended to place blame. Because remember how Laura had said, some of these things are outside of people's control. And that's really true. Sometimes investigations get transferred. And so there might be a finding based on previous work, and that's not this investigator's issue, right? Because they didn't have control over that. So we're looking at the whole process, not just that one worker. So when we are finished with our QA review, then we give feedback. And the QA monitor system allows us to create reports and determine proficiencies for each question. And there are handouts, samples of the reports that we gave, and that's in the back of the participants manual. We calculate proficiency, and it's based on the number of yes responses divided by the yes plus no responses. Sometimes we answer a question NA that doesn't get included in the calculation at all. It's just yes divided by yes plus no. So our reports will show for each question the yeses, the nos, the NAs, the proficiency, as well as what types of no responses were provided. We also have a heat map created, which shows proficiencies by unit or supervisor. This heat map actually allows us to see the proficiencies at a glance, to see what offices or areas are struggling or where things are going really, really well. Sometimes those successful areas, we want to go and examine to figure out what's going well. What do they have that maybe other people don't? That helps us with the root cause that we'll be talking about in April. Reports are also provided with the reviewer comments, which helps provide more information about what was seen during the review. So it's not a guessing game when feedback is given. Well, why did they give a no here? It's clear in the comments, or it should be clear in the comments of what's going on. An essential part of our QA process is for the field to review the information and remediate any findings. Remediation is where the finding is addressed through an action. So we talk about within scope. So within the time the investigation was created to the date the investigation was closed, these are things that could happen within that time period. So this might be maybe they had not documented privacy well in the case note. They can, in our system, they can edit the case note. So it's not editing, it's amending. I apologize for that. So they're amending the case note. It'll show that there's an amendment to it, and it'll document how they did it in private and how they know that. So they can amend that case note. They can upload a document. Sometimes there's things that happen within the investigation, but it's not within that scope, not between the date the investigation was created to the date it was closed. So it might be that the finding might have to be changed, or maybe we didn't send a referral to a community partner. So the date itself will be after the investigation's closed, but it still is required to have happened. So we still do that. And then sometimes there will be outside the scope. And that's where it's historical. There really is nothing we can do. We entered the case note, but it was after 10 days, which is our standard in Washington State. We have to enter case notes within 10 business days, and they entered it on the 11th business day. It's historical. We can't do anything within that investigation, but that's also a good finding to help the supervisor, to help the area, to try to figure out why are these case notes being entered late, what's happening with that, and what processes they can put in place to make change. When the field is reviewing, they might also see a potential error and request a change to a QA finding during this phase, and that's fabulous. We love to have change requests because we're not perfect people either. And so if they're catching something, if they say, no, it's right here, we can evaluate it. Did it actually follow policy or not? And we might overturn that. If we don't overturn it, we might take it to a committee of APS leadership to say, should this be upheld or should it be overturned? That is a wonderful part of this process. When the field receives the QA feedback, they also begin work on root cause analysis, understanding where the gap in the process is and why it may happen. We're not going to talk about it here, but we will be having a session on that in April. And we know that this piece of the process is critical for understanding gaps and making change. So we have to always go through this review and remediation process. Once this review and remediation period is over, then the QA team checks the actions and we complete the review in QA Monitor, ending that review cycle. So the Office of the Assistant Secretary, we complete a review cycle for central intake and for each region. Once all of those reviews are completed, then we can begin the process of aligning questions with any policy change in preparation for the next review cycle, because we know that policy throughout the year gets adjustments. And so we want to make sure that we're aligned before we begin again. So this is our structure. So we complete a review looking at a 3-month period of time for central intake in each region. But we also have systems in place to examine the entire calendar year. Subject matter experts complete 30 reviews per quarter, which works out to about 120 per year per area. And the goal of this process is more like spot checking. So they have a better understanding of what is happening within APS work to support the change. They're also looking to see, are these interventions effective? Maybe we're starting to see, ooh, this is happening a lot more over in this area. How do we make changes within our period? But so we're not just looking at 3 months and calling everything else good. We are doing those periodic spot checks throughout the year. And that's super important to make sure that we are still providing consistent quality work for our vulnerable adults. So when people hear the word QA, they groan and think, oh, I'm being criticized again. The QA process does not point out, or does point out where the problems are, but it can also point out where things are going well. The messaging needs to be that QA focuses on the process, not the person. We utilize written policies and procedures to guide how we review. There's a difference in the minimum necessary effort and what best practices are. And this work has been limited to only examining those minimum requirements. So you can have a great investigation and have not met those policy standards, and you'd get a whole lot of QA findings. On the other hand, you can have met all those findings and you're reading the investigation going, ooh, wow, that wasn't our best work. So we're kind of missing the boat on some of that. It's that overall quality that we've kind of been missing. If you entered your note on time, did it have all the information that was needed, that it should? And then when you have multiple people completing QA reviews, it's important to ensure consistency in how people are reviewing. If a supervisor is doing the required reviews, checking to see everything before it's closed, are they overlooking a piece of the review because they don't agree with that part of policy? Or do they forget to look for that piece? So consistency is huge. When a process or procedure is changed, it takes time for that process to be established and become part of the work. And as we've added new steps to investigations, it can affect proficiencies, which can in turn impact morale. As we implement interventions, it also takes time to see results from those interventions. Finally, when we talk about QA and measurement of compliance with policy, we don't know that if that measures quality outcomes for Washington State residents. We've not done that research yet to build that connection. We're hoping it does, but that's still a challenge that we need to address. So we were already addressing key performance indicators. So we should all be good, right? Well, as you can kind of tell from what we've said previously, we realize that key performance indicators only show so much. You can have an investigation or intake that addressed all of those indicators, but was really lacking in quality for the vulnerable adult and for APS. We knew that we needed a better picture of what was happening. So through the American Rescue Plan grant of 2021, we hired focused QA staff to complete comprehensive qualitative reviews of APS investigations. Through this grant, we were able to look at not just the laws and the RCWs, but address the best practices based on training standards and expert feedback. We also examined feedback from litigation, direct work in the field, and consulted stakeholders on expectations for quality investigations. So our staff created qualitative benchmarks looking at the investigation, not just what was covered within the key performance indicators, but also beyond. So comprehensiveness and thoroughness of the investigation, protection of the vulnerable adult, documentation of evidence, following policy guidance, and respect of the autonomy of the alleged victim. Because of the limitations of this grant, this process is linear, not cyclical. We started by aligning our policy training and expectations for how the investigation would be completed. We then pulled statistically significant samples and then completed the reviews. We analyzed the information and provided feedback to executive leadership. And the most important part is taking that information and analyzing the current process to see how we're doing and what some necessary system changes are. We wanted to look over time to see trends. So we pulled samples from the same quarter for 4 years in a row. I apologize, it looks like our numbers are off. So from 2019 to 2022, and can anybody guess why we went back to 2019? Pre-COVID, right? Because we kept hearing, oh, well, we're having issues because of COVID, because of contingency plan, because of that. So we said, let's go back and look what was going on right before that. And boy, we got some more information. We knew that while we might have added trainings or policies or COVID happened, by picking the same quarter, we knew that we were generally comparing the same period of time. The benefit is that generally when we're looking at the third quarter, there wouldn't be overlap with the key performance indicator reviews because those review between the fourth quarter and first quarter of the calendar year. We also wanted to examine a specific type of investigation. So we pulled another sample from a different quarter and focused in on that type. And so we completed 1,779 reviews of investigations. We did not look at intakes with this process with those qualitative benchmarks. So there's a difference between key performance indicators and qualitative benchmarks. So we were looking at, with key performance indicators, we look at the evidence that's within the documentation. So what's there? But with qualitative benchmarks, we look at the possibility for gathering evidence. Maybe there were unanswered questions. What else could have happened? Key performance indicators is an annual review process. We do the review, get feedback, interventions are made, we come back and review again. Qualitative benchmarks was a one-time review. Our focus was to understand what was happening over time and develop ideas and goals for moving forward. We weren't expecting to come back and try that again right now. With key performance indicators, the focus is on the unit, the investigator, the supervisor. Feedback is given and that particular investigation or intake is addressed. We look down to that micro level. With qualitative benchmarks, our focus is on the macro or what's happening overall. We pulled our sample based on the state numbers, not the region, not the area. We're looking for trends in what we're seeing that might address the bigger statewide systems, not what's going on in the region. For key performance indicators, our questions are very narrow and limited. We're looking to the minimum standard to have focused on meeting policy standards, to focus in on that. With quality benchmarks, our questions are expansive and examining a comprehensive review. This is focused more on what is considered to be best practice, even if it's above and beyond the minimum standards of policy expectations. And that's really difficult when you're thinking about this, to think about holding someone to best practice when we're not looking at all of those other pictures. So minimum standards for compliance with key performance indicators, that's where we need to be because we're not looking at those other pieces. With key performance indicators, anytime there's a finding, feedback is provided and remediation action is expected. Things like adding a case note or uploading an overlooked document. The expectation is that each finding will be examined and addressed in some way. With qualitative benchmarks, we didn't have the same expectation. Anytime there's a big issue, one that impacted health or safety of the alleged victim, we would provide that information and it was expected that that would change, but we did not do a follow-up to see if it would happen. We allowed the leadership of APS to do that. Otherwise, we looked at our findings as trends throughout the state, not for things that needed to change for those investigations. With key performance indicators, we pulled a sample size based on the region or intake and allowed us to focus down. And as I said before, with qualitative benchmarks, the sample size is statewide. So that really is looking at that bigger picture. So what's the difference between the two? So an APS investigation is closed with a disposition, which we also call a finding. And there are two QA questions, one for key performance indicators and one for qualitative benchmarks. Was the finding supported by the evidence is the key performance indicator, and was the correct finding selected is a qualitative benchmark. These seem really similar, but we examine them differently. So with key performance indicators was the finding supported by the evidence. We're looking for what was found within the investigation. Is that disposition supported by the existing case notes and the uploaded evidence? And was the correct finding selected according to policy guidance? So when we looked at investigations within quality benchmarks, we started with, was the correct finding selected according to policy guidance? So it's kind of the same. But then we also looked at, did the investigation, did the evidence in there, did it address all the questions raised? Were there more things that maybe we could have dug a little bit deeper into that might have helped us with move into a different direction for how it was closed? Is there potential evidence that was referred to but not collected that could have changed the finding? And that was really huge. We're not saying that it would have changed the finding, but could it have moved it into a different direction if some of that evidence had been collected? We examined the proficiencies over the same time for the same 4 years reviewed. With key performance indicators, was the finding supported by the documentation? We were doing great. Statewide, we had pretty high numbers between 94% and 98%. We were doing awesome. Great work was happening. But then when you look at the quality benchmarks for the same time frame, for the same 4 years with a similar question, we weren't doing that great. So we were down in the 50% to 48% proficiency. So why is there such a big difference between the two? When information is published about reviews and it's looked at the same way each year, people get used to it and they know it's expected of them, which is a good thing. What is measured is what is being paid attention to. That's how they're documenting it. So they're used to it. With quality benchmarks, we took a look at what the existing work was as is. So this really now is our control group. Now we can know what is actually happening in comparison to how we're training. We know what minimum standards are and we're meeting those, or we're mostly meeting those. Now we can begin the work of increasing the quality. So QA activities are so important for helping identify areas to strengthen the work of APS. QA is a measurement of compliance with policy. And by focusing in on that, it removes the thought that having to do the investigative work or intake work because QA said so, it moves it into a different direction. Everyone wants to do their best work. We know that. And QA is actually showing that it's happening. And if not, providing information which can allow for change. When policy and practices are rolled out, sometimes variation can happen, and I'm sure it never happens with your areas. Having a centralized QA looking at each region area the same way allows APS to understand where differences may be, understand reasons why that is, and make those changes. We found that the practice of talking about QA as a measurement of policy has led to an increase in the understanding of policy. And that really seems like a no-brainer because everybody reads policy and we say, yep, we read and agreed to it. But this practice has opened up conversations about, oh, I understood it this way, but it really means this. So we've come to understand how to write policy to support the field, to understand how to apply it, even in all of those what-if situations. Examining the data gives clear information and allows us to move away from assumptions. And we ask clarifying questions about what is happening to help all staff feel connected to the mission, vision, and values of APS. They can understand what the process is, that the process is meant to be supportive and not punitive. And changing the attitude away from the fear of getting talked to about everything they've done wrong to being able to have that conversation about what they are seeing and their ideas that would help bring change, because they are the subject matter experts. They are doing the work. They know what would make change, and being able to have those conversations is very important. This work has also allowed Washington State APS to invest in the process of change. By completing the key performance indicators and the qualitative benchmarks, we're seeing where we can make that change and recognize that we need to support the people doing that work. This is a time-intensive process, and that in order to make change, we need to dedicate resources. We have hired quality improvement coordinators as subject matter experts, and they are organized at the headquarters level to help guide the process and to begin to make the measurable change. Previously, we had people in the field or each region, and they were responsible for leading this process. Well, when this is not their only job, they have multiple things to do and they get pulled in different directions, and you can't really do that well. So by having people who are dedicated to this work in QA and in quality improvement, that's their job. They're going to know, they're going to provide the best support to the areas. All right.
You know, Erica, can I say something of, can you turn it back to the results of qualitative versus the key performance measures with the bar graph? Something to think about when I'm talking to staff is, they get very bummed out, as you can imagine, when the results are that low, 40%, 38%. They're very shocked and very upset, and they're punishing themselves, and they hate the QA process. But what I like to point out to them is, when you think of the process approach, do you think that's a performance issue or a process issue? When you get that low of score, that means a lot of people had to miss the same thing across units, across the state. That isn't a performance issue. That's a clear process problem when you get proficiencies that low. Not everyone is having a performance problem at the same time. That's just not realistic. And so when I see results like that, I really am not judging them. I'm looking at them. I'm not assuming, again, what we mentioned to them, I'm not assuming you're not working hard, trying hard, and want to do your best. That is out of my mind. I'm looking at that and I'm just very curious. I wonder what's going on. I wonder where that is that we're having the biggest issue. I wonder how they're training. I wonder what their policy and procedures say. So just be curious. That's how I would go into it, and talking to them that, no, we're going to talk to you about it, but it's more, what do you think was missing in our process? What do you think we can improve in our process so we don't miss this? I wouldn't be saying, why did you miss it? What's going on with you? I mean, as supervisors and managers and things, what did we miss? What are we not doing? Again, not to blame yourself, not to punish yourself either. It's like, there's something in our process we're not doing it. Maybe an internal control, a checklist, a thing to make sure we do this. Just be curious is what I would encourage you to be. So,
thank you for pointing that out. That's huge. All right. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Erica and Laura. And now we're going to move into our question and answer portion of the workshop. And I had mentioned at the beginning that we're doing this a little bit differently this time. We this time have the opportunity to have Tiffany Rowe with Butte County and Maria Loera with Riverside County to moderate and facilitate this Q&A. So Tiffany and Maria, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. Following up briefly on just what Laura kind of closed out with, given that California is not a state-run APS system, what would your advice be to half of us that don't have QA processes yet in place to get that initial engagement started?
Okay, so for me, again, I would may I ask, do you have access to change management professionals, or do you have people on staff that have that background at all? That would be the first thing. I would start to engage with them.
I'll just speak just specific to my county. I have 1 APS supervisor and 7 APS social workers. That is the extent of my APS program.
That is it. Okay. And do you have QA?
No.
Okay. So if I'm you and I'm going, what am I going to do here? I still would go through the process I just said on the initial part. Like you say, you don't have the waivers and all that stuff to worry about, but I would still look at, what are my contractual agreements? What do I have to do? I would still go through the whys and what's important to us and why we want to do this, to start it that way with the staff and say, we're going to start looking at these processes, and here's why we're going to do this. It's not because I've noticed that you guys have been a problem or doing poor work or any of that. It's just something that I think is important, and here's why. So I'd start with that, and the root cause analysis one will help to explain what you're trying to get out of QA. But for your situation where you don't have a lot of resources and things, it's going to start with very small QA questions, very minimal. So in your case, if you do have certain laws or things that you have to do of response times, things of that nature, those are going to be in the QA. It could be that if you have more resources with IT, do you have IT resources?
We have internal staff that runs
Okay.
our systems. Yes.
IT stuff. Okay. And so in some cases, instead of actual workers doing QA and doing reviews, you can get reports that can do things that we would find manually. Like if you have a report that has all your timeliness, and you have a system that keeps track of that and they can program that behind the scenes and things of that nature, that's going to minimize the FTEs you need to do QA and things of that work, because you're having technology do it and the system's doing it. So utilize that as much as possible. But I know QA creating and programming takes a lot of time as well. But that's something to think about, is the technology that you already have access to. Even if it's 5 questions right now, that's QA. It's just start getting them used to the QA process. The more resources you have, the more QA questions that you can have. Keeping in mind that the more questions that you have, the more questions that could be missed and have findings, they have to be corrected on top of the work that they already are doing. And so they have to do all the remediation. They have to do, in our case, root cause analysis for each question that's below expected proficiency. It just creates more and more and more work, right? So that's why I recommend you start slow. You do a QA review. It could be in SharePoint. You may not have a QA monitor tool like we do. You have minimal stuff. It's okay to do that by email, by SharePoint. There's different things. I know Erica has done reviews in SharePoint. She would, I'm sure, be willing to meet with someone and show them how we did that, to have reports that come out of SharePoint and things of that nature. But I would just say starting slow would be my suggestion, and still explaining why you're doing it, though. Don't skimp on that piece of the purpose and why you're doing it, and ease into that. Did that answer your question? Because it would require the manager to do the QA review. Let's be honest, that you don't have if you don't have resources of a QA unit, it would take the manager doing the QA review. And that's why I say you'd have to probably be less questions, because they are going to be overwhelmed with it as well.
Laura, I'm hearing, and to Tiffany's point, right? Some of our counties in California specifically are quite small and have limited funding. And I'm hearing you say that sometimes it's about leveraging those resources that you already have, right? And looking at sometimes even the supervisory review process, right? Most often in our programs, we have a supervisor reviewing the work that's being done by our investigative workers. And so maybe being able to take that and looking for opportunities to collect the data so that it can be analyzed. A question for you would be, how do you tailor that message in a way that makes it palatable for staff when this really to them translates into added workload? So we know that they care about safety. We know that those pieces are there, but the reality of it is that it's added work. And so how do we message that, and how do we leverage those resources in a way where we're minimizing impact to increasing workload?
Yeah, you're at a little bit more of a disadvantage than Washington, because I can easily say it's required. We have to do it. So you don't really, it sounds like you don't have that leverage of saying it's a code of federal regulation. We have to do these things, etc. So that's why I would go back to, why is this important? It has to outweigh the workload at times. And that's why I would start small. Is what I'm saying, is like, you don't have a lot of time to do this. We have to pick the most important things that have the biggest impact and explain to them why you're selecting those things and why that's important to do. You have to have a checks and balances to ensure that we're doing things appropriately so we can make sure that these individuals are safe and people can remain healthy in the community. I mean, I don't know how else to explain the importance of doing the check. Without that, you could be putting, like I say, putting resources in areas that aren't even necessary. It's I think when you have minimal staff like that, and you think of all the work that they have to do, think about if you say, if we can make this more efficient and we can make this more clear to you, you can complete your work easier. It's less stressful, all of those things. So I would talk about a little bit of the positive of what can this QA do for you to hopefully reduce your workload that you have, because we're not being efficient. We're not doing things in proper process. We're missing things. Some of the stuff that we find is, we start to talk to the people that are doing quite well and we say, what's your process? And they go, we don't have one. Yeah, you do. How do you make sure this stuff is getting done? Oh, well, I set aside time in the morning and I do this and this and this and this. And so sometimes getting to QA and getting to root cause, we start to get the help from other people, and it starts to make things more efficient, and people are happier because they're more successful with the work that they're doing and things of that nature. But because I don't know your staff and what matters to them, it makes it a little bit harder for me to make a recommendation. I would just think about asking them what's important to them, what things that they want to make sure they're doing correctly and things of that nature. But it's hard when you have limited resources. But to me, I've just always had to explain the importance of QA and why it's valuable and what it can do for them. But I can't take away the extra workload. That's why we had to create the quality improvement team, which we had the ability to do, which I understand you do not. But we did have to take some of that work away, because literally they were like, we can't keep up with this in addition to our work. So we did have to specify certain people to do that. Now you can ask for grants. You can do things. That's what we had to do with the qualitative benchmarks. We didn't have staff to do that. Qualitative. That's why we do the minimum that we have to do with the key performance measures, because that's all the resources we have. We had to do minimal. So the qualitative benchmarks was a grant fund. So that's something you might want to look into, is some of the grant money that you can access for quality improvement and quality assurance. It's quite popular right now for grant funds, is what we're finding. Erica, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, you're 100% on point with everything you said. I would also talk about the investment part of it. So as you're investing the staff, as you're investing the time in this work, the goal is that the findings will help you streamline the process, which will lessen the workload in the future, right? Because as we're seeing, oh, maybe we're having people document in 3 places, and that really is part of the problem of why it's taking so long to address this. As you're doing that QA review and you're looking at it, you're like, oh, well, why are we documenting in 3 places? We only need to document here in this one. That is a time saver. That's a streamlined process. But we wouldn't know that unless we put the time and energy up front to really look at that whole piece. And that will hopefully have less findings, and it'll be an easier way to walk through in the future. So
well, the other thing that I've found is, I don't know about you, but when I talk to, for instance, we have assistant secretaries, you may have administrator, other people, directors, etc. You need to come with facts. You need to come with data to prove why you need certain resources. And so what I have talked to staff is QA can be your friend in this. Sure, the results may be poor right now because it's the first time we're looking at it. The proficiencies are low, but it also is going to show us where we have those gaps. And it could be to justify FTEs. It could be to justify new technology. It could be a lot of things, but they didn't have the data to go, in our case, to the legislature or whoever it was that you have, to justify the need to get them the supports they need. So when staff are like, this is a lot of work, this is a waste of our time, it may feel like it up front, but in the end, it could help justify things to help us get resources, which can reduce your load. But until we do this up front, we're not going to get it at all, ever. So I don't know how your system is, but for us, it has been very crucial, and it has allowed us to get more FTEs. It did show us the quality improvement piece by doing this grant and doing the quality benchmarks and showing that we need to make improvements. And the only way to do that was to get a QI team. That is how we got the resources. So we had to do all that work up front to do it. I think Elise has a question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention for some of my California peers what we're starting to do in our county, because we don't have a QA process. But when we look in our LEAPS system, there's a lot of data we can pull out of there. So we look at that. Our black and white compliance data is pretty good. So what we did is we went to our staff and we said, what's important to you about working with your clients? What are you concerned about when you're out there working with them? And so they gave us some ideas around recidivism, around connecting with community partners, and this feeling that the community partners right now, because we don't have a strong continuum of care on the adult side like we do on the children's side, that the community partners were like, APS, you fix it, you fix it, you fix it. So we did some analysis around my two supervisors. I have two APS supervisors. Did some analysis around why do people come back through? And a lot of it has to do with people going into the hospitals wanting to get them out. Generally, it's our older homeless population. The shelters don't want to deal with them because they're incontinent. So they kick them out of the shelters. They end up on the street. They end up back in the hospital, and it's this cycle. So now that we have that data, that is the primary reason we have MDTs, that is the primary reason why we have recidivism. We now are starting to meet with our community partners and try to develop a stronger continuum of care system. And it's more work for our staff because they keep their cases open longer, but they're invested because this is a issue for them.
Right.
And so that's how we went to them to say, what is the issue for you from a qualitative perspective? And that's what we're working on. And we're not going to wait for the state to do it, because the state, sorry, if you're CDSS, will tell you what we come up with, because that's what we have to do. Because for our small county with very few placement resources, we have to send most of our folks out of county who want to go to a SNF. And we have to work with all our partners to get them there if they agree to go, because we don't have the resources here in the county. But we need to do something to strengthen our county system, or we're going to continue to have these cycles.
Yes. Great work. See, that's what I was saying. You want to talk with them and get their ideas and incorporate them into your process. We did that as well with our meetings at work. We call them work groups and things, and talked about the questions and had them decide, what do you think is the most valuable questions, and narrowed some down based on what they were saying. And that's typically the practice. The more they're invested in it, the more they're going to be supportive of it and understand why they're doing it and the importance of it. And I think that's more the conversation. And I think usually what happens is people create QA and just tell them the next day that this is what we're doing, or they're surprised by it. And that's when you're going to get the biggest pushback from people. More transparency, more upfront work, the change management pieces.
So much, Erica and Laura and Elise. Great question. Excuse me. We're going to move into the breakout groups now, so that you all will have the opportunity to talk with one another about more of these questions. We have some suggested discussion points to help guide the conversation, and we'll share those in Google Docs. we're going to ask you to just take some high-level notes. Please feel free to be as, as open in your discussions. Those aren't recorded, and we're not asking for that information, but just any high-level themes that you think would be helpful to share, and then we'll gather that information, put it together, and share it out after the workshop. So Erica and Laura, thank you again. You're welcome to sign off now as we move into the breakout portion. And Victor, go ahead and launch the breakout groups when you're ready. We can still plan on 20 minutes for the breakout groups. And again, this time we had heard your feedback about wanting more time to talk with one another and smaller groups, so that each person has more time to talk and connect. So we're trying that out this time. You'll let us know what you think.
Thanks for having us. We appreciate it.